He shot the bear and thought it was over. But years later, on a silent winter night, something came back. Not for revenge, but for something far more terrifying. What happened next will make you question everything you believe about animals and about yourself. When I first heard the snow creak on the porch, I told myself it was just an elk wandering too close to the cabin. But a heartbeat later, the blood drained from my head, because I knew, with the kind of bone-deep certainty you don't argue with, that it wasn't a mistake and it wasn't the wind. The stove had burned down to coals, leaving the one-room cabin wrapped in the kind of hush you only get 3 days' hike from the nearest road. My radio was out, my coffee long cold. I'd volunteered for this midwinter wildlife survey, believing I craved solitude. That night, solitude felt like a trap. Every sound, the tick of cooling iron, the brittle snap of timber in the frost, seemed carved into the silence with a knife edge. Outside, the temperature had fallen so low the air itself almost rang when it moved. Then came that second crunch, slow, deliberate, heavy enough to tremble the floor against my boots. I killed the lantern and stood still, listening. A blizzard-dim moon spilled milk-white light across the frosted panes. Nothing moved. No shadows slid across the snow. Another step. The wood beneath the porch let out a tired groan. Whatever was out there had weight and purpose. I slipped my coat on over my flannel, slid the old mag light from its hook, and chambered a round in the rifle out of habit more than courage. The bolt's metallic click sounded unforgivably loud. My breath clouded the air. The cabin smelled of pine pitch and iron and the copper tang of fear. The door latch felt brittle under my glove. I pushed it open just wide enough to lean into the night and swept the beam across the yard. He stood to my left, a pace from the steps. A mass of winter-black fur almost lost against the tree line, except moonlight struck the ragged scar that split his muzzle from eye to jaw. One foreleg hung awkwardly, leaving him three-legged in the snow. Yet he held his head high, shoulders rippling under a pelt thick as shag carpet. His breath plumed white. His eyes, impossibly steady, caught the light and threw it back in molten amber. I didn't think. My body locked between the rifle stock and the doorway. Sensation squeezed to a tunnel. The crunch of snow under his shifting weight, the distant hiss of wind through fir needles, the thunder in my own chest. A bear that size could close the distance in a single bound, crippled or not. I waited for the bluff charge, the roar, the inevitability of claws. Instead, he did something I still can't fit inside words. He simply watched me. Seconds, or maybe a lifetime, passed between us in that gaze. In the high beams of the flashlight, I saw recognition flicker like heat lightning behind his eyes. Not the dumb curiosity we project onto animals to comfort ourselves, but recognition, as though somewhere, buried inside scar tissue and winter fat, he remembered my scent the way burned wood remembers flame. My knees dared to unlock. The rifle lowered, not by choice, because the will to raise it left me. The bear's nostrils flared. He inhaled once, deep and slow, tasting the air between us. Snowflakes clung to his fur and melted, like small lights dying. He shifted, favoring the wounded foreleg, but not retreating. All that power, and he chose stillness. Something loose and hot slid behind my ribs. Shame, maybe, or the sick certainty of déjà vu. Years ago, I'd taken a reckless shot at a grizzly on the far side of the valley. A stupid, frightened trigger pull that had snapped a great beast sideways into the brush. We never found a carcass. I convinced myself he survived, that the mountain was wide enough for both of us. Looking at the scar that split this bear's face, I felt the past climb out of its grave. "Easy, old boy," I whispered, voice catching like a splinter. My words fogged in the beam. The bear's ears twitched. His mouth opened a fraction, not snarling, breathing, gauging. Fear drained out of me the way tide slips from a beach, leaving only raw awe. I saw him, really saw him, and knew he should hate me. But he didn't move forward, and he didn't flee. He simply existed in that impossible distance between hunter and hunted, where revenge might have lived, yet didn't. The maglite trembled in my fist. Its beam quivered over the ridge of his spine, the hunch of knotted muscle, the pale rim of frost on his coat. The bear blinked once, slow as dusk settling, then shifted his weight, turned, painfully, and limped off the porch clearing. Under the trees, he melted into shadow until only the scar's pale seam marked his passage, like a comet tail fading in black sky. I stood there long after the crunch of snow vanished into forest hush, after my breath stopped steaming, after sensation returned in needles to my fingers. Adrenaline left me hollow. A rational voice insisted I'd misread the scar, that this was coincidence, that memory plays cruel tricks in isolated cabins. Another voice, older, wilder, said I had been recognized and spared. Somewhere beyond the tree line, a branch snapped, echoing like a gunshot across the valley. I jolted, half expecting the bear's dark shape to materialize again, but the clearing lay empty under the winter moon. Finally shivering harder from what I felt than from cold, I backed inside and dropped the bar across the door. The cabin felt smaller, the air thinner, as if the woods themselves had leaned in close to watch what I would do next. I sat on the bunk, rifle across my knees, the lantern still dark. In that darkness, I watched the door and replayed every second. The limp, the scar, the way he looked at me not as prey, not even as predator, but as something he already knew. I told myself Dawn would make sense of it. The tracks would prove it was some passing rogue and nothing more. I almost believed the comfort of that lie when fatigue dragged my eyelids down. But comfort cracked the moment I heard the slow, deliberate crunch of snow return the following night. The sound came back just after midnight, the same slow crush of ice crystals under a weight no human could carry. My pulse leapt so fast it felt like it rattled the stovepipe. I doused the lantern, eased one eye to the frost-filmed window, and there he was again, exactly where he had stood the night before, as though the hours between had never happened. He filled the porch frame, a dark continent against the snow's pale glow. No huff of breath, no warning growl, just that monumental silence pouring off him in waves. The wind carried spruce-scented needles across the clearing. Each needle seemed louder than my own heartbeat. His scar caught a slice of moonlight like a brand, and I knew with a certainty colder than the air that he had come for me, not by accident, not by hunger, but by memory. My mind did the cruel thing minds do when cornered. It tore open the past. I was barely 20 when a grizzly erupted out of the alders above Miller's Creek. I reacted like every storybook hunter says he will. I raised the rifle and fired. One shot. The bear spun, a ribbon of red blooming across his muzzle, then crashed downhill and vanished. We tracked until snow swallowed the trail. The old woodsman with me said the same words all cowards cling to. He'll make it. I believed him because believing otherwise would have meant facing what I had done. Now, decades later, that very scar, that single jagged flash of white tissue, caught the light on my porch. The bear shifted his weight, favoring the same crippled foreleg I remembered stumbling through brush all those years ago. Recognition slammed through me like black water over rapids. I felt my lungs forget how to draw breath. He stepped closer, paw pads whispering on the boards. The porch lamp, long since blown out, creaked on its chain above him. 2 paces separated us, one for each lifetime we had lived since the shot. His eyes held none of the rage I deserved. Instead, they brimmed with an unreadable intent that made rage feel like a comfort by comparison. Instinct screamed to shoulder the rifle. Conscience nailed my arms to my sides. Instead, I lifted the door just wide enough to stand in the threshold, body half inside, half out, as if balance alone could keep the past from swallowing me. Easy, I managed, though my voice trembled so hard the word fractured. He cocked his head, nostrils flaring, pulling the scent of my fear, my remorse, maybe even my name out of the air. Another step. The floorboards sighed under his weight. He could have ended the story in a heartbeat, a single sweep of paw, a lunge no man could dodge. But he didn't. He stopped so close I could see frost melt where his breath touched the wood. His eyes, gold as lantern flame, held mine, and something broke open in my chest, guilt so sharp it felt like glass. I found myself retreating, inch by inch, until the door pressed the rifle stock against my ribs. I couldn't lift the gun, didn't dare. Instead, I drew the door shut between us, slowly, as though speed might shatter the fragile, wordless truce hanging in the winter air. The latch clicked home. I dropped the bar across it, then stepped back in the dark and listened to my heart hammer the room smaller. Outside, the porch groaned again, a shadow passed the window, then nothing. Not the scrape of claw, not the burst of breath, just silence so whole my ears rang. I sank onto the bunk, boots still on, rifle across my knees, hands refusing to unclench. The stove fire had died down to whispers, but sweat chilled on my spine. Each creak of timber could have been a paw step. Each gust sliding past the eaves could have been him testing the walls. I did not sleep. I measured the night in slow breaths and flinches, telling minutes by the drift of starlight across the floorboards. Once, near what must have been dawn, I thought I heard him exhale right outside the logs, a deep, sorrow-heavy sigh. But when I braced myself to look, only shag bark and snow stared back. Gray morning finally seeped through the window panes. I unbarred the door with hands that felt older than bone and leaned out. Wind had painted the clearing pristine, yet here and there a chain of prints dented the crust, wide, round, deliberate, leading away into the tree line. The porch itself held a dusting of fur where his flank had brushed the railing. He was gone. No broken boards, no claw marks, no blood, only absence, ringing louder than any roar. I swallowed a shake of relief so fierce it tasted like shame. Maybe, I told myself, I had imagined the recognition in his eyes. Maybe the scar was coincidence, the limp a trick of half-light. I almost managed to stitch that lie over the jagged hole in my nerves. But as the sun climbed and the forest glittered in cruel, ordinary brightness, I caught a flicker of gold deep between the pines. Two eyes, steady, patient, watching. That gaze pinned me as surely as any bullet, and the lie I'd sown split wide open. I thought the encounter was over. I thought he had vanished into legend, leaving me to mend fences with my conscience. But then, again, that same unblinking stare, waiting in the trees, telling me the story had only just begun. The third night arrived thick with clouds, the moon buried so deep the world felt roofed in pitch. I had just banked the stove when the woodline exhaled a hush that prickled every hair on my arms. Then the now familiar weight pressed onto the porch, one massive paw, then another, boards mumbling under him. My pulse steadied into dread. He had come again, but the beam of my flashlight caught more than the scarred giant. A second shape limped from behind a spruce. A cub, no bigger than a Labrador, one forepaw tucked uselessly against its chest. Snow clung to its downy coat in clots the size of dimes. It wobbled, collapsed, pushed up again. The big bear kept pace a body length behind, head low, eyes fixed on me, as if gauging whether I would understand the impossible favor he was about to ask. For a breathless moment, all four of us, the man, the giant, the cub, and the night, hung in a silence that felt like the earth holding its breath. My tongue glued itself to my teeth. This was madness. Wild animals don't deliver their injured to human doors. Yet here he was, my ancient sin, limping beside him. The cub whimpered, high, thin, heartbreakingly human. Something inside me shattered. The big bear closed the last yard to the porch, nudged the cub forward with his nose, and then, God help me, took two deliberate steps back. He sat on his haunches, head bowed as though granting me space or begging grace. All the old instincts shrieked, lock the door, stay alive. But the cub swayed, wheezing with each breath, blood from a torn pad stippling the snow like red seeds. The father, or guardian, or whatever bond stitched them, watched, muscles coiled, yet made no move to intervene. What do you want me to do? I whispered, voice strangled. The cub answered by collapsing a second time, too weak to rise. Some gears inside me ground free. Rifle forgotten, I unlatched the door, slid forward, and scooped 15 pounds of trembling fur into my coat. Its heart battered my ribs, but when my arms closed, it did not struggle. I smelled milk on its breath, sap in its fur, fear so raw it stung my eyes. I backed toward the doorway. The big bear rose but did not follow. He stood just beyond the stoop, moonless night making him a living silhouette, anguish carved into the tilt of his scarred muzzle, a soft chuff puffed from his chest, neither threat nor complaint, more a sigh of unbearable trust. Inside, the cub curled beside the stove without hesitation, head on its good paw, eyes half-lidded. I knelt to examine the wound, deep slash across the pad, maybe ice, maybe trap iron, clean but swollen. I melted snow, stirred in stale oatmeal and a dash of honey, slid the warm mush across the floor. The little mouth lapped twice, then sleep folded it under like a wave. Only then did I register the door still gaping to the night. I rose, flashlight trembling. The porch was empty. No crack of branch, no grunt of retreat. As silently as falling ash, the great bear had vanished into the trees. Alone with a sleeping cub and a pounding heart, I bolted the door, shoved a dresser against it, then sagged to the floorboards. Everything in me roared argument. Wild creatures carry disease. They panic. They bite. His father, if that's what he was, might come crashing through the wall if the cub cried. Yet another voice, older than reason, whispered that some debts can only be repaid in courage. Hours dragged, fire hissing, my knees stiffening as I kept watch. The cub stirred once, whimpered, then found my boot toe with its nose and settled again. The weight of its trust pressed heavier than any rifle stock I'd ever shouldered. I must have dozed sitting upright, because dawn seeped through the frosted window before I dared unbar the door. The clearing lay ghost quiet, snow unbroken save for the fading prints of the previous night. No hulking shadow waited at the timberline. No thunder of breath under the eaves. Only the sharp, bright stillness of a world washed clean. I let out a breath I didn't know I'd been holding. Maybe, I told myself, he'd return at first light to reclaim what was his. Maybe this guardianship was a single night's mercy. The cub, now awake, blinked up at me with dark marble eyes, then nudged its muzzle against my shin in a gesture so childlike it stole speech from my throat. I thought he'd be back to take the little one the moment the sun cleared the ridge. Thought this was a simple relay of survival. Bear to man and back to bear. But noon passed. Then evening draped its long blue shadows across the snow. And the great scarred sentinel who had once known my bullets did not return. 15 winters in these mountains had never taught me how to splint a bear cub's paw. I improvised. A strip of flannel, whittled spruce slat, pine pitch salve I once carried for my own blisters. The cub whimpered when I tightened the bandage, then leaned in and sucked the wool sleeve of my coat as if it held his mother's heartbeat. That sound, wet, trusting, unbearably small, turned the cabin into a cathedral. Food came next. Oatmeal again, cooled with snow melt and sweetened with the last of my raisins. He licked the tin clean, nosed it across the floorboards, and fixed me with eyes round as planets. Gratitude, real, disarming gratitude, can live in a gaze no bigger than a silver dollar. I felt it cut straight through every layer of flannel and shame I owned. Keeping him warm was simpler. I laid my wool blanket beside the stove and let the little body curl into the crease of my knees while I read trail notes by headlamp. Each time the lamp's beam drifted near, he blinked and gave a muffled huff, then settled, nose twitching at the wood smoke that scented both of us now. The storm outside gnawed at the shutters, but inside his breathing synced with mine until I no longer knew which chest rose first. Days fell into a rhythm I hadn't meant to write. At dawn, I boiled spruce needle tea, mixed powdered milk into porridge, and coaxed him to lap it. Midday, I carried him, splinted paw tucked under his chin, onto the porch so sun could touch his coat. He'd press against my leg, sniffing the wind as if memorizing every scent that blew across the valley. And every night after I barred the door, I listened harder than a priest in confessional for the heavy cadence of the adult bear returning. It never came. By the fifth evening, the emptiness outside felt as loud as any roar might have. Dusk bled purple over the snowfields. The cub dozed against my boot, and I found myself stepping onto the porch alone, scanning the tree line with the cabin's weak lantern. Branches clattered, ravens called, but the clearing remained void of scar and shadow. Who am I that he trusted me? The question slid between my ribs and stayed there. I pictured the giant's bowed head, the way he had offered up this fragile life as if my hands could rewrite fate. Trust is a weight. Its strange, luminous heft made my shoulders sag more than pack straps ever had. Inside, I trimmed the cub's bandage, rubbed salve into cracked pads, and spoke nonsense lullabies I half remembered from childhood. He answered with throaty chirps, the beginnings of a growl too small for menace, and peered at me like I was some peculiar new constellation. When I scratched the cream-colored scar above his eyebrow, his eyelids drooped in bliss and he toppled sideways into my lap. Warmth seeped through my denim like spring through permafrost. Yet even wonder breeds worry. The splint kept infection at bay, but without real meat, his strength returned in cautious increments. I had snares along the ravine, but setting them meant leaving him unguarded, and every mile away felt like betrayal. Instead, I rationed my own supplies thinner and thinner, jerky shredded into slurry, canned salmon diluted with broth. Each evening his energy grew, mine waned, and still the father bear's footfalls never thundered back to claim what was his. On the seventh night, I dreamed the cabin walls dissolved, and the cub followed the scent of spruce into darkness while I groped after him, crying apologies that scattered like flakes in wind. I woke drenched, the little body still asleep against my ribs, trusting me with a peace I no longer believed I had earned. I carried that guilt outside before breakfast, hoping mountain air might bleach it. Frost glazed the porch rail in lacework patterns. Sunrise painted the valley in fire. No movement, no paw prints, nothing but immaculate snow stretching to the pines. The adult bear was simply gone, slipped through the weave of the world like smoke. A treacherous thought crept in. Maybe I had imagined his size, his scar, the pleading in his eyes. Solitude does that. It folds memories into fever dreams until truth blurs like breath on glass. I stood there so long the tea went cold in my cup, letting doubt sand down the ache of expectation. By late afternoon, the cub was strong enough to nose the door, sniffing at drifts he longed to tumble through. I promised him tomorrow maybe we'd hobble a few yards into sunlight. He answered with a soft bruff that vibrated against my palm. That night, silence pressed tighter than the logs themselves. I sat by the stove, scribbling half-legible lines in my field journal. Splint holding. Appetite good. Still no sign of sire. If trust has a shape, it is 15 pounds of fur asleep by my boots. The lantern guttered. Shadows climbed the rafters, and I realized I was waiting not just for a bear, but for absolution. Without it, the cabin felt both sanctuary and cell. Hours later, embers waned to ruby specks. The cub stirred, nosed my ankle, then sighed back to sleep. Snow sifted against the shutters like whispered confessions I couldn't quite catch. I began to believe the great scarred giant, the gaze that knew my worst and still delivered me hope, might have been nothing more than a guilt-born phantom. I almost let myself rest in that consolation, until a branch snapped somewhere deep in the timber, loud as a verdict, and the night leaned closer as if to say, dreams don't leave footprints. But he did. That ninth night, the little one stopped eating. He nosed the bowl, licked once, then turned away and curled tight, muzzle hidden under good paw. Fever heat shimmered off his body like stove air. Every breath rattled, wet and shallow. Splint or no, infection had found a door. I tried everything. Warm broth dribbled from a spoon, snow packed against his belly to cool the burn, honey on my finger for him to lick. Nothing stirred his eyes. By midnight, his ribs fluttered like moth wings. My own heart beat an awful time with the pauses between each gasp. I stoked the fire, then killed it when the heat seemed to smother him. I read half a psalm I barely remembered, the words tripping on my tongue, half prayer, half plea. Keep watch with me. Don't take him. Not after all this. Outside, wind shifted, bringing the bitter scent of distant cedar smoke. Or maybe that was just my hope of someone wiser drawing near. Hours dragged, measured by the clack of his teeth when a chill racked him. I paced grooves into the floorboards, every turn ending at the door as if the right kind of staring might summon help. Eventually, I sank beside him, palm resting on his heaving flank, whispering nonsense. Camp songs, apologies, the story of the first sunrise I ever saw from this ridge. His ear twitched once, but he stayed adrift, eyes rolled white. Then a sound split the dark, Not the neat crunch of a fox, not the brittle snap of settling timber. This was a thunderclap of force, porch boards exploding beneath impossible weight. The dresser jolted against the latch. Dust rained from rafters. I froze, half gratitude, half terror. Another impact rattled the hinges. Through the narrow crack between planks, I saw a shadow blot the snow, huge, breathing hard. The cub stirred, whimpered. My hand found the rifle, lifted, then stopped. If he wanted in, no deadbolt forged by man would matter. I slid the bolt, heart battering my ribs. The door yawned wide enough for winter air to roar past. He filled the opening like night-given muscle, scar catching the glow of coals, shoulders rimed in frost, breath puffing smoke. His eyes swept the room, found the bundle at my knees, lingered. I expected rage or accusation, or the desperate panic of a father too late. Instead, he stood still, ribs pumping, listening. For a long moment we traded silence, thick with everything unspoken between hunter and hunted. Then he huffed once, a sound low and mournful, yet resigned, and backed away. One step, another. Snow squealed under his crippled foreleg. He turned and vanished into the tree line, without so much as a snapped twig. I stayed in the doorway long after the bruise of his presence faded, the rifle forgotten at my feet, cold gnawing my bones. Behind me, the cub exhaled a shuddering sigh, and for the first time all night, slept without trembling. Morning pried at the shutters before I dared hope. When dawn poured gold onto the floorboards, the cub lifted his head, blinking slow but alert. I pressed a finger of water to his lips. He lapped, then nipped for more. Fever had broken, skin cool, breathing deep, the rasp gone. He even tried to rise, testing the splinted paw with cautious weight. Relief hit me so hard my knees buckled. He came, I told the rafters, throat raw. He knew. No other explanation fit the impossible timing, as though the great bear had carried some ancient medicine in his presence alone. Or maybe the cub's will to live only rekindled when he sensed that watchful love close by. The valley glittered under new snow, unmarred except for a single corridor of prints leading to the porch and away again, already drifting soft at the edges. I traced them with my eyes until they disappeared among blue-black trunks. Part of me wanted to follow, to drop to my knees in frozen needles and offer whatever apology a beast might comprehend. Another part understood that last night was the apology and the forgiveness, all condensed into one thunderous visitation. The cub ate a double ration at noon, blinking up after each lick like he'd discovered flavor for the first time. He even rolled onto his back, inviting a cautious rub of the downy belly. Laughter barked out of me, startling us both. It tasted rusty, like a tool long unused. From that hour on, I believed the great scarred guardian might never return. His task, whatever vast instinct had driven it, seemed finished. But belief, I was learning, is a flimsy fence in these mountains. And the wild has a habit of stepping over fences the moment a man thinks he has the measure of it. By the 14th morning, the cub was a whirlwind of new strength, clambering around the cabin on 3 good paws and 1 splinted stump that barely slowed him. He nosed every skillet, toppled a stack of field logs, and discovered, to his squealing delight, that a hanging bootlace made the perfect toy to murder. Laughter spilled out of me so often I started to forget what silence had felt like. When I unbarred the door to sweep ashes, he shoved past my leg, buried his whole face in a drift, and sneezed himself backward, eyes crossed in comical indignation. Sunlight struck his coat and lit the gold underfur that had been hidden by crusted ice the night he arrived. He cocked his head at a red squirrel chattering from the roof, then let out a cub-sized roar. Nothing but air, but he looked scandalized that the squirrel didn't faint dead away. The splint came off that afternoon. The paw was ugly but solid. He set it gingerly, testing weight, then discovered that clumsy bounds ended in face-first snow dives that were apparently the funniest things in the world. I watched him tumble, shake powder from his ears and try again, each attempt a little steadier. A line from an old song drifted up. Teach your children well. I hadn't taught him half of what he'd taught me. By dusk he curled at my feet, muzzle sticky with berries he dug from a stunted juniper. His eyes found mine. and a pang opened under my sternum. Sweet, sharp, undeniable. He didn't belong to stone walls and iron stoves. Every heartbeat I kept him here was a smaller cage. That night I packed a rucksack, smoked trout, a pouch of honey granules, the last of my raisins. At dawn I slung it over one shoulder and whistled him outside. He bounded ahead, thinking we were off on another playful patrol around the yard. Instead I headed downslope, following a narrow game path that cut through the black spruce shadow toward the river basin. Far enough that instinct would tug him deeper rather than home. Snow groaned under my boots. Branches snapped back with icy kisses against my cheeks. The cub trotted at my heel, sniffing prints I couldn't see. Twice he reared and slapped my thigh, demanding the wrestling game we'd invented, and each time I had to swallow a lump the size of a fist before I could rumple his ears and answer. We reached a clearing where sun poured through a gap in the ridge, lighting cedar trunks like cathedral columns. The air smelled of thawing bark, promise, and something wilder. A musk I recognized from the night the guardian bear had first emerged. The cub scented it too, his nose bobbed in the wind, ears swiveling, body poised on the edge of instinct. I knelt, slid the ruck off my shoulder, and untied the flap. He watched, head canted. I set out the trout and honey on a flat stone, then pressed my palm to his chest. "This is yours," I managed, throat raw. "All of it is yours." He licked a smear of honey from my thumb, then leaned fully into me, weight warm and solid. When I tried to rise, he followed, pressing against my knees like a child refusing to be put down. I stroked the rough ruff behind his ears, memorizing the way his fur parted under my fingers, the tiny pulse fluttering above his collarbone. "Time to go, buddy," I whispered. Wind rattled cedar fronds overhead. He chirped, confused, and tried to climb my leg. That broke me. Hot tears spilled, freezing almost instantly on my lashes. I crouched, arms open, and he folded against my chest, front legs hooking around my neck, claws dull against wool, muzzle burrowed under my beard. The hug of a toddler, the hug of forgiveness. I held him until my knees shook. Finally, instinct overruled affection. He dropped to all fours, gave one last nuzzle to my boot, then padded to the banquet on the stone. He gulped trout, lapped honey granules, and without looking back, loped toward the wall of cedars where twilight pooled. At the tree line he paused, turned once, and for a heartbeat those marble eyes held mine. Not pleading, not confused, simply knowing. Then he slipped between trunks, and the forest swallowed him without a sound. I stayed until shadows erased the clearing, listening for a crack of branch, a grunt, anything. Only ravens argued overhead. When numbness climbed my legs, I turned toward the cabin, each step heavier than the pack straps that once defined my youth. All the way home, I rehearsed a lie that might dull the hollow. He'll be fine. Bears are born to vanish. But the moment I latched the empty door behind me, the cabin walls echoed with absence so loud it drowned words. I was certain then, absolutely certain, that I would never set eyes on either of them again. And for a time that certainty felt easier to live with than hope ever could. 4 winters had come and gone since the cub's paw left its last print outside my door. In that time, the valley changed the way a face ages, subtly, until memory feels like a photograph tinged at sepia. The Forest Service kept asking if I'd extend my contract, as though the ridge were an office and timesheets mattered to Spruce. I stayed because some debts can't be paid off anywhere else. January brought a cold so dry it sang through the stovepipe like a flute. One dusk, while the kettle rattled and my logbook lay open to blank pages, a sound rose from the tree line. Not the sharp report of frost-split bark, not the rat-tat of squirrel claws, but a deliberate shuffle, slow and weighted. The hairs on my arms lifted before my mind supplied hope. I killed the lantern, stepped onto the porch, and let moonlight paint everything silver. Snowflakes drifted, each one snapping in the air like static. At first I saw nothing but the uncompromising dark of trunks. Then 2 shapes slid out of the timber, materializing the way memory sometimes does. First, the towering bulk of the scarred patriarch, his outline unmistakable even beneath a new frosting of age. Beside him, nearly as tall, moved a second bear, sleek, broad-shouldered, stride fluid, despite a faint hitch in the left forepaw, where a pink puckered scar showed under the fur. My throat sealed shut. For a heartbeat, I was back in that first winter panic, except this time wonder crowded out fear. They halted a dozen yards from the porch, close enough for Moon to catch in their eyes. The old bear met my stare, amber on human hazel, and every season since our first reckoning collapsed into the space between those 2 points of light. The younger one sniffed the wind, then, I swear, cocked its head exactly the way the cub used to when it begged another spoonful of honey. Recognition cored me like an apple. Whatever wild algebra governed survival had solved for him. Cub minus mother, plus stranger, multiplied by years, equaled a full-grown force of muscle and will. And now he stood here, presenting the answer. Neither advanced. It felt as though some invisible borderline, drawn in trust, rooted us all to separate shadows. I took one cautious step forward, palm open. Nothing to give but heartbeat and breath. Frost squeaked under my boot. The young bear mirrored the motion, not toward, but as if to say, I know that sound. I saw him register my scent, maybe dredge up the ghost of oatmeal and pine pitch salve. Snow sifted off branches overhead, sprinkling silver dust across their backs. The big bear's scar looked paler than I remembered, a riverbed etched by time. His lame leg trembled, but he held himself with the composure of a monarch. He turned his head toward the younger one, touched muzzles, a benediction or a dismissal, then returned his gaze to me. Gratitude lived there, yes, but also something larger. Permission, perhaps, to lay my guilt down at last. Wind slid between us, cold enough to sting tears from my eyes. I mouthed, "Thank you," though sound failed. The young bear exhaled a chuff so gentle it fogged and fell like breath on glass. He looked at me the way a child looks across a crowd for the one face that proves the world once held kindness. Then, as if obeying a cue older than language, the patriarch pivoted. Snow swirled around his hindquarters. He limped into the trees without haste. The younger paused, met my eyes one final time. And there it was, the echo of that cub hug, now full of bone and muscle, but softer somehow for the memory inside it. He turned and followed. Their silhouettes merged with the blackness between cedars until only the hush remained, vast and ringing. I waited for a crash, a farewell roar, anything to break the seal of that moment. But the forest swallowed them whole, leaving two parallel tracks that led away like sentences, trailing off mid-thought. For the longest while I stood motionless, breath ghosting up into star-freckled dark, convinced the story had closed itself with that silent benediction. My legs shook from cold and awe in equal measure. Finally, I whispered, "Go well," to the empty clearing, and turned back toward the orange glow of the stove through cabin windows. I was halfway across the porch when a single deep crack echoed from the ridge. Not threat, not warning, more like a tree snapping its fingers to remind me the mountains keep their own epilogues. I froze, heart battering ribs, thinking, that's it, the circle's complete. But the forest exhaled again, low and certain, as if answering a question I hadn't yet learned to ask. And I knew the wild wasn't finished speaking. I shut the door on the moonlight and leaned my back against the cold wood. The cabin smelled of pine, soot, and iron, the same smells I'd inhaled 1,000 nights before. But this time the weight behind them cracked something loose inside me. My shoulders began to shake. Sound clawed up my throat, half sob, half prayer. Prostimenia, I whispered, the Russian word I learned from my grandmother, the one that carries more ache than the English sorry ever will. Forgive me. Tears followed, hot and humiliating, cutting through the windburn on my cheeks. They dripped onto the rifle hanging by the door, onto the boots still powdered with snow. I pressed a hand to my chest as though I could cage the tremor, but the tremor was truth, and truth wanted out. All those years ago, I had pointed a barrel at a miracle and pulled the trigger. Tonight, that miracle had walked out of the dark, scarred, limping, yet brimming with something larger than fury. Mercy. It brought its son, full-grown and unbroken, to show me what forgiveness looks like when fur and winter and time refine it to its purest form. I slid down the wall to the floorboards, knees pulled tight. The stove clicked as iron cooled. Each click was a metronome counting the beat of a new life I hadn't earned. In that ticking quiet, my thoughts spilled like thaw water. I thought nature kept ledgers, that every hurt demanded interest. I thought survival was an endless trade of fang for flesh, bullet for blood. But the mountain teaches another math. Balance can settle with kindness instead of claws. The longer I sat, the clearer it became. The bear had been given 1,000 chances to take me apart. He'd chosen every time to stand still, first alone, then with the cub, and now final and complete, with the grown companion at his side. A trilogy of mercy, a trinity, if you count the mountain itself. I drew a ragged breath and spoke to the rafters, to the ghosts of every animal mount that ever hung in my father's den. We were wrong, I said, voice shaking. We were blind. Nature doesn't carry grudges. She carries lessons. And if we miss them, she shows them again. Louder, clearer, until even a fool can't ignore the grace in her silence. The room blurred, but behind the blur I saw it all. My younger self stumbling through brush, ears ringing from the shot, a cub sucking honey from my fingertip, a scarred sentinel standing watch while fever fled his child's body. Two great shadows tonight, meeting me eye to eye as equals. No more, no less. If someone had told me, I murmured, wiping my sleeve across my face, if someone had told me, I'd have laughed them off the ridge. Nobody believes a bear can forgive. Nobody believes a man can change because a silence looked him in the eye. I could feel the mountain listening through the chinked logs. Words came slow, pulled from marrow. I have seen a bear come to forgive. I have held his child in my arms, and he looked at me, not as prey, not as enemy, but as a fellow keeper of breath and blood in winter. He looked the way a father looks when he lays down his fear to lift up his young. He looked with a wisdom that does not belong to men, yet invites men to borrow it. I pressed my palm flat against the rough floorboards as if grounding an oath. If the wild can choose compassion over vengeance, I said to the empty cabin, then every story I ever told about domination was a lie born of smallness. Nature isn't cruel, she's careful. She gives us chances to become worthy and waits. The stove ticked once more, then settled. I rose, legs unsteady, and set another split of spruce on the coals, not to chase the cold, but to honor the heat that still thumped in my ribcage. Flame licked up, bright and forgiving. I closed my journal, knowing the only entry that mattered was already written in scar and paw print outside. Instead, I faced the dark window, saw my reflection hovering over moon-silvered snow, and spoke one last time for whatever ears might be listening beyond the glass. If someone had told me, I whispered, I would never have believed. But now I know. I stayed there until the kettle began to sing, until tears dried and left only salt, until peace filled the cabin, corner by corner like dawn light. And so, friend, if your heart is thundering in your chest right now, if you feel the echo of paw steps in your own ribs, then you understand what I'm trying to share. If your heart is pausing between beats, hit subscribe. Stay with this channel. Here we tell the truth the way the mountains tell it, raw, shivering, and brighter than fear. Nature is wiser than we are. If you believe in that secret thread binding us to every living thing, write in the comments, we are not alone in this world.
She rose up on her hind legs and looked me straight in the eyes, and in that moment, I realized she didn't want to attack. She wanted me to see something. When I saw the she-bear rise onto her hind legs, my breath caught because I understood. She was calling me. I am 62, though the locals still call me Hawk from my years as the village game warden. The badge is gone, the rifle boxed up after a cardiologist warned one hard jolt could finish me. These days I take slow walks in the boreal morning, nothing more strenuous than tapping a spruce with my stick. That dawn seemed harmless. Thin May sun slanted through snow-damp branches, and I was humming an old folk tune when the forest exhaled her. She stepped from behind a birch, cinnamon, rangy, winter fur still shedding. Any sensible man would back away, but I froze. The bear didn't charge, didn't even huff. She just stared. I remember the crunch of melting snow under my soles, the tang of sap rising in the air, the way the wind carried the distant drumming of a woodpecker like a heartbeat, all ordinary notes in the spring symphony, until they fell away into a single, echoing silence comprised of her presence. My first instinct was the old ranger drill: make myself big, speak firm, retreat slowly. But laced through the caution was a thread I couldn't name, a pull older than training, older than fear itself. Something in me recognized the gravity of her stance, the deliberate calm, the unblinking eyes that said, "Listen." As we walked, I kept cataloging exits the way I once briefed rookie wardens: climbable spruce at 2 o'clock, shallow creek to my left, bear spray back home, useless in the shed. Yet each time she glanced back, the world shrank to the quiet pact between us. She would show, I would follow, neither quite trusting, neither willing to break the spell. She dropped to all fours, walked a few yards, then looked back at me. Invitation, clear as speech. "Come." My pulse hammered, yet my boots moved. "Easy, girl," I muttered, not sure for whom the comfort was. She led. I followed, keeping a respectful gap, our footfalls muffled by thaw-soft moss. Every few paces she'd stop, check that I was still there, then amble on. She avoided blowdowns, skirting obstacles the way a guide would for a limping guest. The thought chilled me. She was thinking about my path. What if she had cubs ahead? A sow with young can turn savage. Instinct begged retreat, but each time her eyes met mine, they carried something softer than fear, heavier than hunger. Need. The trail funneled us into a clearing ringed with ancient pine. She stopped at the far edge. Light caught a scar on her shoulder, old bullet burn, maybe from poachers. She rose again, sniffed the air, then settled, watching me as though the next move was mine. I saw nothing special: patchy grass, last year's cones, and a silence so thick it throbbed. I should have marked her behavior, reported it to fish and game. Instead, I whispered, "What do you want me to see?" Raven wings cracked overhead. She flinched, but stayed. Seconds stretched like taffy. Under her gaze, the world felt suspended. Then she bowed her head, slow, deliberate, touched nose to earth, and flicked aside a paw full of duff. A simple gesture, careful as someone turning back a quilt. I edged closer and knelt. An earthy smell rose, rot mixed with a sudden cedar sweetness. She shuffled back 2 paces and sat, waiting. My glove scraped away needles. Beneath them the soil had been disturbed recently. Expecting nuts or a cached kill, I brushed again, and felt cloth, stiff with age, dyed a fading cherry red. Everything inside me folded. 30 years ago, that exact red lit up the knit cap my 5-year-old Greta wore the day she followed me into these woods and vanished. Air sucked out of my lungs. Trees wavered like mirages as memory crashed. Search parties, dogs, my wife's cracked prayers, the official line, presumed dead. Life staggered on around a hollow core. Now, in a bear's clearing, lay the ghost of that day. The she-bear chuffed, low and throaty, almost soothing. I looked up. Her eyes shone with a tenderness that defied every wildlife manual I ever wrote. No dominance, no threat, only a solemn ache, as though she carried grief parallel to mine. My throat closed. Knees hit dirt. Tears burned cold cheeks. I held the shred of yarn like a heartbeat. She watched without moving. For a mad second I imagined she might press her muzzle to my shoulder. Instead, she remained still, sentinel to my storm. I don't know how long that hush lasted. Man unraveling, beast serene. At last she exhaled, a sigh deep as river ice breaking, turned, and walked back the way we'd come. Halfway she paused, looking over her shoulder, amber eyes thick with unsaid things. I wanted to shout questions, chase her, anything, but language felt too small. She slipped into spruce shadow, branches swaying closed behind her. I thought I could simply leave, bury this scrap, and the memory with it. I even stepped back, heart rattling, but the forest leaned in, whispering, "Not yet." Somewhere deeper among the trunks, her rumble rolled like far thunder, still calling me. I thought I'd walk away and forget that strange gaze, but now I know this was only the beginning. The morning after the redcap revelation, I woke before first light, pulse ticking like a drum. All night the forest had whispered inside my skull, the bear's amber stare refusing to fade. I told myself I only wanted fresh air, that my heart needed the walk, but truth crawled under every excuse. I hoped she would be there. Gray dawn unrolled like thin silk over the treetops. I took the same route, boots crunching frostbit needles, every sense stretched. For a while nothing stirred but chickadees. I started thinking I'd imagined her, grief conjuring a guardian out of shadows. Then, just past the beaver pond, a shape stepped from the gloom. She stood broadside between two cedars, coat dark with dew, head slightly lowered. No huff, no swat, only that unwavering gaze pinning me as surely as any whisper could. A breath left me in a cloud. I lifted my empty hand so she could see. She blinked, turned, and began to walk. "Okay, girl," I murmured, legs moving before the thought finished. I kept the gap wide, a dozen yards, maybe more, but didn't dare lose sight of her shoulders rolling beneath shaggy fur. A ranger's habits die hard. I marked wind direction, escape trees, angles of sun. Yet each practical note felt flimsy beside the raw conviction that she wanted something from me. Every few strides she glanced over her shoulder, dark eyes flicking to mine like a lighthouse beam. She was measuring me. She kept looking back, checking if I was still coming, as if she was afraid to be alone. The notion sliced deeper than claws ever could. We crossed an old skid trail where moose tracks chevroned through mud. Instead of following the easy wildlife corridor, she veered onto a faint, overgrown footpath I recognized from my warden days, a line men once hauled maple sap along. Saplings now arched over it, but fallen trunks were oddly absent. She wove around fresh blowdowns the way a person would thread furniture in a dark room. That deliberate choice prickled my scalp. She wasn't taking the bear's way, she was taking mine. 3 times she paused at forks, waiting until I closed within a few steps before pressing on. I whispered nonsense to keep my voice steady. Weather notes, scripture fragments, Greta's nursery rhymes, anything to keep from drowning in the rising tide of impossible. Half a mile in, we skirted the edge of an abandoned trapper's cabin. Roof caved, door sagging, the place smelled of mold and rusted memory. She kept the cabin on her left, arcs gentle, never forcing me into tight quarters. It hit me that she was steering clear of confined spaces, choosing openness where my frail heart could breathe. Sun climbed, frosting spiderwebs in gold. Underbrush thinned, replaced by moss hummocks soft as quilts. She slowed to a saunter. I noticed her right rear leg bore a faint limp, old wound stiff in the morning chill. Instinct pushed me to pity. Training told me never show weakness. Both urges tangled until I simply followed, half man, half question mark. She stopped where a birch snag leaned against a granite outcrop and sat on her haunches, breathing steam. I held still, hands trembling more from wonder than fear. She swung her head toward a stand of younger pines ahead, then back to me, then forward again. Clear direction. There. I stepped past her, boots sinking into spongy earth. A squirrel scolded overhead. She ignored it, shoulders easing as I took point. 10 yards in, the ground dipped into a shallow bowl carpeted with last year's needles. The air was damp, tinged with something metallic, something sorrow-sweet. I crouched, brushed leaves aside. Nothing this time but dark soil. My chest tightened with embarrassed disappointment. Had I misread her completely? I turned to look back. She was still at the snag, head low, watching with an intensity that hurt. Not predator hunger, expectation. I scanned the hollow again. A thin trail of overturned moss led off to the right, so faint a tracker might miss it. She must have nudged something here earlier. I followed the sign like a blind man reading Braille. The trail ended at a clump of rotting stumps. Wedged between two roots lay a strip of fabric knotted around a small wooden spool, the kind of toy pioneer kids twirled on strings. The fabric, once blue, was now sun-bleached to gray, but the stenciled daisies screamed across decades straight into my gut. Greta's Sunday dress had matched that pattern. I knew because my wife stitched it herself, cursing dull needles and singing lullabies in the same breath. My knees buckled. Fingers shook as I freed the spool from the knot. The wood was gnawed on one edge. Tiny teeth marks. Maybe chipmunk. Maybe a child long gone. Wind sighed through the pines like voices just out of reach. Behind me, the bear made a low rumble, almost a hum. I faced her, tears hot on cold cheeks. Why me? My voice cracked like old bark. She dipped her head once, a solemn nod that felt older than any creed. A rational corner of my mind scrambled for explanation. Maybe she'd lost a cub and wanted help. Bears adopt orphaned young sometimes. Or she'd grown used to scavenging near camps, learned to read human cues. Maybe. But deep down, I felt the flimsy paper of every guess tearing against a truth too large to name. I wanted to help her, to help whatever missing thing she mourned. Yet I was the one being led, not the rescuer. I thought maybe she'd lost her cub. I wanted to help, but I had no idea she was guiding me toward the single most important moment of my life. I tucked the spool and fabric inside my coat, heart hammering like axe blows. The bear stood, muscles rippling, and with one last backward glance moved deeper into the trees. She didn't hurry, didn't threaten, only trusted I would follow. And heaven help me, I did. I pushed farther into the spruce gloom, the scrap of Greta's dress hot against my chest, the bear's lumbering shadow always just ahead. At some point the wind died, and the forest pulled a hush over itself so complete, I heard my own heart ticking like an old pocket watch. That was when it came. A thread-thin sound, half sob, half exhale, so faint I wondered if it belonged to memory, not flesh. I halted, tilting my head. It drifted again, neither bird song nor branch creak. A stifled whimper carried on no breeze at all. The she-bear stopped in the same instant, muscles stiffening beneath her coat. She pivoted, nose questing, then locked her gaze on a solitary jack pine jutting from a mossy rise. Instead of advancing, she folded onto her haunches, forepaws planted like stone pillars. Every line of her said, "Wait." I swallowed. My ranger brain spat warnings. Never corner yourself, never step toward a stationary sow. But the plea in her posture outweighed every drilled reflex. She wasn't guarding, she was guiding, and now she left the final yards to me. I edged forward, boots sinking into damp loam. The strange cry fluttered once more, fading as quickly as it formed, like someone trying not to be heard. A chill rippled my spine. Windless days can make trees groan in their own joints, but this sound wasn't wood complaining. It was wounded breath. The jack pine loomed, trunk twisted with age, its lowest boughs mantled with lichen. I expected claw marks, a den hole, some sign of a cub. Instead, my eye snagged on the base where the roots heaved up in a thick knotted hump, earth cracked and sagging around them, as though the tree had tried to swallow something too large and failed. Fresh dirt streaked the bark, dark against the pale scales. Instinct made me drop to a crouch. I traced the rise with gloved fingers. The soil was loose, recently disturbed. A sharp scent, iron and damp cedar, rose when I brushed aside needles. My pulse hammered so loud I feared the bear might hear. Behind me, she remained utterly still. She just watched me. She didn't growl. She didn't even breathe loud. It was as if she were praying. I probed deeper, unearthing a circle of woven birch bark no wider than a dinner plate. Its center bulged, stitched tight with spruce roots that had grown over whatever lay beneath. Years must have passed for wood to clutch the object so possessively. My mind reeled. Who hides something under a living tree, and why would a bear bring me here? I glanced back. Her eyes glistened, catching a shard of light like wet amber. Not a flicker of menace, only solemn urgency. The forest around us seemed to lean closer, branches holding their breath. I wedged my knife under one root, levering gently until it popped free with a damp snap. The bark disc shifted. Another muffled whimper escaped the earth. Or was it only air sighing through the sudden gap? Hard to tell with blood roaring in my ears. As I peeled the lattice up, rot sweet scent poured out, mixed with something strangely floral, like dried lilac trapped in time. Beneath the bark was cloth again, but not bright this time. Faded ivory linen, folded into a small packet, edges tied with a strip of leather. The knots were clumsy, child-sized. My throat closed. Hands shook so badly I had to steady one wrist with the other. A single tug parted the ties. Inside lay a wooden whistle carved in the shape of a loon, paint long flaked away. I hadn't seen it since Greta's 6th birthday. She'd loved the hollow, mournful note it made, pretended the loon answered her across evening lakes. The hurt hit so hard my knees sank into moss. Tears blurred everything. I pressed the whistle to my lips, but no sound emerged, clogged with dirt, just a mute memory of song. The bear uttered a low moan, deep and heartbreaking, and in that vibration I felt an echo of every sleepless night, every search party lantern fading in fog. I whispered, "Why are you doing this?" My voice cracked like a frost-split branch. She lowered her head, eyes never leaving mine, as if the question itself was the answer, because someone had to. Silence folded over us again, thick and brimming. I realized I was kneeling at a grave of sorts, yet what was buried wasn't a body, but fragments of childhood, preserved by roots and watched over by a creature no textbook could explain. A rational man would flag this site for forensics, call authorities, rope it off. I could barely rise, let alone think protocol. I slipped the whistle into the pocket beside the fabric scrap, two pulsing relics against my ribs. The bear still sat, breath slow, ears relaxed. Not triumphant, not impatient, simply present, the way a chapel holds presence long after candles burn out. I felt a wordless vow pass between us. I would keep following until the forest relinquished its full truth, or swallowed us both. If I'd known what else the earth was ready to yield, I might have turned back right then, whistling my daughter's mute tune to drown the fear. But the woods were only just finding their voice, and I was only beginning to listen. I didn't leave the hollow that night. Dusk seeped through the pines, and I lit a single match to keep my courage warm. The she-bear lay a short distance off, head on paws, eyes reflecting firefly glints. Every few minutes she lifted her nose, tested the wind, then settled again. A silent promise. We were not done. At first light she rose, shook the dew from her coat, and walked to the jackpine. She waited until I stood beside her, then swung her massive head toward a neighboring spruce whose roots sprawled like knuckles across the moss. One claw scraped the ground. There, dig. The soil was looser than I expected, sifted like someone had already started the work. I set aside my gloves, sank bare fingers into the cold earth, and scooped. Each handful smelled of rot and sap and something faintly sweet. Old lilac again, the scent that haunted Greta's bedroom. 6 inches down my nails snagged fabric. I paused, heart stuttering, then pulled gently. A blanket emerged, wool once plum-colored, now a patchwork of mold and time. Mice had chewed holes the size of coins. I spread it on the ground, and the bear lowered her head as if recognizing a flag. Under the blanket lay a small wooden box, warped but intact. I traced its lid, feeling shallow knife marks, a child's attempt at carving flowers. The latch was rusted shut. One hard twist snapped it. Hinges groaned like old doors in a dream. Inside, neatly arranged despite decades underground, were three objects: a yellowed plastic pony, a cracked marble that still caught shards of morning sun, and a curled photograph. I lifted the photo with shaking hands, afraid it might crumble. The image was drained of color, but the shapes were unmistakable. A little girl in a knitted cap, grin wide enough to swallow the sky, one arm thrown around the neck of a stubby-legged bear cub. Both faces glowed with a trust so pure it hurt. My knees folded. I fell to the forest floor, and the she-bear watched me. She didn't move. She just let out a long sigh, like a person finally allowed to speak the truth. 30 years dissolved in an instant. I was back on the porch calling Greta for supper, back in the search party shouting her name into fog, back in the sterile office where a deputy slid a file across the desk and said, "You need to consider the likelihood." I had considered it every day since. A likelihood is not a goodbye. Now here she was, alive on paper, laughing beside a cub that could only have grown into the animal breathing 10 yards from me. The air around us warped, full of sounds no ear could catch. I pressed the photo to my chest, sobs breaking loose like thunder under ice. The she-bear took one slow step closer, then stopped, as if any further might shatter us both. Memories tumbled, Greta slipping sugar cubes to a neighbor's hound, rescuing a fledgling that fell from the eaves, promising she'd never fear the woods because, Dad, the animals know me. I had smiled then, proud and a little amused. I wasn't smiling now. A rational voice in my skull screamed, coincidence, hoax, hallucination. I wanted to believe it. Easier to doubt my senses than admit nature had been safeguarding my daughter's relics while I cursed the dark. I told myself I must be losing my mind, or that this was some cruel trick, but what came next wouldn't fit any logic I owned. The bear pawed the earth once more, nudging the box toward me. Then she stood on hind legs, towering, chest bold, eyes locked on mine. For a heartbeat, we were the only creatures in the turning world, old ranger, older forest, and a messenger in fur. She dropped back down, huffed softly, and nudged the blanket forward too, as if insisting I claim it. My fingers closed around the toys, the cloth, the faded smile. Heat flooded my ribs, painful as frostbite thawing. I understood then that she hadn't just found these things. She had kept them, moved them, saved them, until I was brave, or broken, enough to follow. "Thank you," I whispered, the words small, insufficient. She blinked once, solemn, as if acknowledging a debt paid on both sides. The sky had shifted from rose to pale gold. Somewhere a thrush began its morning scale. I packed the box, wrapped it in the blanket, and cradled it like a newborn. The bear turned, nose pointing deeper into the trees. Another path waited, roots knotted with secrets. I rose on unsteady legs, photo clenched tight. The forest opened ahead, shadowed and luminous all at once. My grief, once a cavern, was now a corridor, leading somewhere I could not yet name, and the she-bear walked on, sure-footed, never glancing back to see if I would follow. She knew I would. The path the bear chose tunneled through young firs, and as I followed I felt the need to speak, if only to keep from splintering. My words spilled into the hush, meant for her, for the trees, maybe for myself. 30 years, I began, voice snagging on pine-scented air. Greta was 5, small enough that her rubber boots slapped together when she ran. That morning we'd had late spring sun and puddles the size of silver dollars. I told her I was checking sap lines before supper. She begged to tag along. I told her next time. She stood at the gate pouting, red cap slipping over her ears. I waved and promised stories when I got back, then strode into the woods, whistling the same tune my father taught me. I never noticed the soft patter behind me, the shadow half my height darting from trunk to trunk. Halfway up the ridge I shot a glance back, for no reason except habit, and saw nothing but trees. By then, she was off the trail, tracking me by sound, certain Dad knew exactly where she was. When the sun touched the ridgeline, I returned to an empty yard. My wife thought Greta was with me. I thought she was inside coloring frogs in her scrapbook. Panic came like lightning, no warning, just white fire. We called neighbors, then the sheriff. The search lasted a week. Dogs combed ravines, volunteers beat brush with sticks, helicopters churned the sky. On day 3, they found her red cap snagged on blackberry thorns near the beaver pond, the same pond I just circled with the bear yesterday. No footprints, no blood, only that bright splash of wool. Tracks were scarce, spring thaw turned soil to soup, but one deputy found claw marks on an alder and decided a predator had taken her. Bears had been seen scavenging trash that summer. A theory formed. Cub-hungry sow, quick kill, body dragged off before we ever reached her. My wife clung to hope longer than anyone. She'd sit on the porch at night humming lullabies, saying Greta would hear them. Grief ate our marriage the way fungus eats heartwood, slow, hidden, inevitable. She moved south 2 years later, chasing heat and silence. I stayed, because one of us had to listen if the forest ever spoke her name again. The state filed a death certificate, presumed accidental mauling. I quit the warden's job not long after. Every bear track felt like an accusation. The badge lost its shine once it failed the only person who mattered. Now I was trudging behind a living relic, clutching a blanket that still held the ghost of my daughter's scent. The plastic pony, the marble, they were hers. I had etched their shapes into my skull from countless bedtime cleanups, but the photograph, that was new. In the picture, she knelt in the grass, one arm hooked around a bear cub's neck, both of them beaming as if the world were simple and safe. I remembered no cub. The girl, though, she was undeniably my Greta, the dimple on her left cheek clear despite the fading ink. Questions rattled inside me. Who snapped that photo? Where was it taken? How had it ended under tree roots miles from our old cabin? More than anything, how had a wild bear come to guard it like a reliquary? The she-bear quickened her pace, and I stumbled to keep up. Branches slapped my shoulders, but memory stung worse. The night the search was called off, the way neighbors couldn't meet my eyes, the hush at her memorial service when no coffin was present, only a stack of watercolor drawings she'd left on the fridge. I kept talking, filling the woods with the story she already seemed to know. We traced rivers, drained ponds, set bait cams. I climbed this very hill 3 times over, screaming till my throat bled. If you were here then, girl, did you see us? Did you watch us blundering, not understanding your language? She flicked an ear, neither speeding up nor slowing down, but I sensed her listening, some mammalian empathy vibrating in the space between us. The sun climbed higher, sweat mixed with tears on my face, salty proof of a heart that hadn't stopped hurting even after decades of pretending. I looked again at the photo, at the way Greta's fingers curled in the cub's fur. Trustful, certain. Who taught her that certainty? Not me. I'd taught her caution, rules, the safe distance between child and wild, and yet there she was, fearless, belonging. A root caught my toe. I pitched forward and would have hit the ground if the bear hadn't paused, blocking the fall with her flank. Unintentional maybe, but it felt like catching. When I steadied, she looked back, eyes soft as upturned soil. Why her? My whisper cracked. Why my child, your cub? The forest answered with the far cry of a loon, the same note her toy whistle once carried across twilight lakes. Something shifted then. Understanding or surrender, I can't say. The question no longer begged for an autopsy of facts. The forest had chosen its own way of keeping her alive, and now it was choosing me to learn the rest. We pushed on, the bear leading, my past trailing like smoke through cedars. Whatever waited ahead, would change every page of the story I'd told myself for 30 years. And for the first time since the cap was found, I felt the faintest glimmer that the ending might not be carved in stone after all. Sleep clung to me like wet wool, but first light found my boots already crunching frost, carrying me back to the hollow. I half expected the bear to be waiting, yet the clearing stood empty, only the jack pine and yesterday's scar on the earth. For several aching minutes I paced the perimeter, heartbeat loud against the hush, telling myself the whole thing could have been grief, dressed up as miracle. Then a branch popped on the far side of the ridge. She emerged, coat steaming in the pale sun, and for one raw heartbeat, I felt the world turn right side up again. She chuffed, low, throaty, then swung her head down the slope. The invitation was unmistakable. I followed, no longer counting yards or planning escapes, just keeping her shape in view the way a child keeps an adult's hand. She moved slower than yesterday, pausing often, glancing back after each pause. She kept looking at me as if asking, "Are you still coming? Are you ready to see what we keep?" The path curled past the beaver pond, past the ragged cabin, back to the jack pine where the blanket grave had opened. I wondered why return here. Hadn't we bled this place of secrets? But she veered slightly east, to a thicket of young balsam that I would have bypassed without thought. She nosed aside a curtain of branches and waited until I stepped through. There, beneath a shallow overhang of roots, lay another cache, a bright splash of color against the dark soil, a child's gauzy scarf, faded sky blue, still knotted like a bandana. Beside it, a flat river stone the size of my palm, its pale face smeared with charcoal lines that once framed a sun and crooked trees, Greta's forest family, a picture she loved to redraw on anything that would hold pigment. The charcoal had blurred in moisture, yet the clumsy sunbeams were hers, unmistakable. My breath hitched. Nestled between scarf and stone was a folded square of birch bark, edges curled but intact. Hands trembling, I opened it and found a single word scrawled in childish block letters. Papa. The charcoal line pressed so hard it gouged the bark. She'd tried so fiercely to make the letters stay. I sank to one knee, throat scorched. Memories slammed back. Greta perched on the porch rail, tongue between her teeth, sketching suns on pebbles while I sharpened her pencils. Greta twirling that same scarf into a makeshift flag the day she first tried skipping stones. All the years I'd believed those mementos lost to mud and coyotes, and here they were, preserved in a vault of roots. Behind me, the bear sat, not threatening, not retreating, simply present, a sentinel of bone and fur. Her eyes held no triumph, only patient questioning, as though she were a teacher waiting for the slowest pupil to grasp the lesson. She gazed at me as if asking, "Do you understand now? Do you see how we remember?" Tears blurred bark into watercolor. "Yes," I whispered, voice ragged. "I see." The forest around us seemed to release a collective breath, needles shivering in a breeze I hadn't felt a moment before. I tucked the scarf and note into my coat, then pressed the drawing stone to my lips. The charcoal left a ghostly smudge that tasted of ash and warm summers. I wondered how many winters the bear had guarded these fragments, moving them when floods threatened or snow packed too deep, waiting for the human they belonged to. A thrush fluted high overhead. The bear's ears twitched, but her gaze never left me. Shame pooled in my chest, shame for every bear I'd once treated as a target instead of a story, for every night I'd cursed the dark instead of listening to it. She had done more for Greta's memory than I had managed in 30 years of mourning. I reached out, a reckless thing, and touched the back of her paw. The fur was coarse, warm with life. She didn't flinch, only exhaled, a rumble like distant thunder rolling off a mountain. That single breath carried absolution deeper than words. For a moment, I thought this might be the end of the trail, I had received my daughter's relics. Surely the forest had offered all it had. Relief mingled with a sudden hollow dread. What if the bear left now? What if silence fell again? This time forever. But she rose, shook the needles from her coat, and turned her head toward a stand of older spruce farther upslope, a place I'd never walked. My pulse quickened. The lesson wasn't finished. The map curled farther than grief, deeper than memory. I thought yesterday's discoveries had closed the wound, but nature was still threading a needle through torn edges. Somewhere ahead waited the stitch that could bind past and present into something whole. I stood, pocket heavy with scarf and stone, and met the bear's eyes. "Lead on," I said. She blinked once, as if satisfied, then padded into the shadowed corridor between spruces, leaving me no choice but to follow, heart stripped bare and ready for whatever impossible truth she would reveal next. The bear guided me higher into the spruce stand, where light thinned to green dusk, and the ground breathed peat and mushroom. We slipped between towering trunks until she stopped before a wind-thrown cedar, its roots ripped skyward like a frozen explosion. In the shallow cave beneath the stump lay a scatter of bones, long cleaned by beetles, and a litter of chewed pine cones. But what froze my breath were the black strokes on the cedar's splintered heartwood, crude charcoal drawings, stick figures, bright suns, clumsy bears, layered like the pages of a child's silent diary. I brushed the wood. The lines flaked under my thumb, but I could still trace the shape of a little girl holding hands with a bear cub, their arms merged into a single, looping swirl. My chest felt too small for my lungs. Somewhere behind me, the she-bear settled onto her haunches, the forest's pulse incarnate. Memory surged. The summer Greta vanished. A local trapper had reported a wounded cub wandering the logging road, ribs showing, paw infected. We set a cage, but the cub evaded every bait, except once. We found the door sprung, fish gone, and inside, a neat pile of blueberries and wild onion shoots. "Someone's feeding him," the deputy joked, baffled. We chalked it up to campers and let the mystery fade. Now I saw that scene anew. A 5-year-old with pockets full of berries coaxing a limping cub, humming the lullaby her mother taught her. I pictured them curled together under this very cedar, her scarf around its ankle like a bandage, her whistle keeping night terrors at bay. My knees gave. The bear watched, head tilted, as if waiting for me to rearrange the past into its proper shape. "You were that cub," I whispered, voice echo small. "And she kept you alive." Wind slipped through the roots, carrying the faintest scent of lilac, Greta's favorite flower, impossible this far north. The odor dissolved as quickly as it came, like a ghost brushing past. A tide of understanding rose. If the cub survived by her hand, then the grown sow might have carried an imprint stronger than fear, an imprint that led her to me now. I crawled deeper into the cedar cave. Beneath a mat of shed fur glinted something metallic. I pulled it free. Greta's plastic barrettes, snapped in half, still faintly pink. Beside them lay the handle of my old folding knife, blade long, rusted away. She must have borrowed it the morning she followed me, a talisman of her father, lost when I was too busy to notice. Tears blurred the drawings until suns and stick limbs ran together like wet paint. Behind me, the bear emitted a low hum, a sound I'd mistaken for threat once, now clearly a murmur of reassurance. She hadn't merely called me here, she was giving me Greta's memory, everything she'd guarded for 3 decades. I turned, holding the barrettes like brittle petals. "Why now?" The question cracked. The bear's eyes were ocean deep, reflecting cedar shadows and my own ruin. She rose, stepped forward, and laid her muzzle against the old knife handle in my palm. The pressure was gentle, deliberate, a signature written in breath. Suddenly, I remembered another fragment from that lost summer, how patrols found tracks of a large bear pacing the perimeter each night. never breaching camp, just circling like a sentry. We assumed scavenging. Now I knew better. It was a cub grown bold, searching for the girl who once sang to it under the stars. A branch snapped overhead. Both of us flinched, instinctive mirror reactions. When silence returned, I realized how woven our stories had become. Greta must have lived for days, maybe weeks, in this pocket of wilderness, trading trust for survival, leaving crumbs of herself the forest still cradled. And when she was gone, how or why I might never learn, the bear inherited the hoard of tokens, a shrine no human eyes had seen until now. I touched the drawings again, tracing the loop that joined child and cub. My heart hammered a new rhythm, less grief, more awe. The bear huffed softly, breath warm on my wrist, as though urging me to finish the unseen sentence. "I understand," I breathed. "You're her witness." Sunlight speared through the canopy, igniting dust motes around us like candle sparks in a chapel. In that glow the bear looked both ancient and newborn, keeper of a bond larger than language. I packed the barrettes and knife handle beside scarf and stone, my pockets sagging with the weight of reclaimed time. She didn't simply summon me, she bestowed her memory, every fragment of Greta left in this world. Her task was almost done. Mine had just begun. The bear stepped back, gaze drifting upslope toward a narrow ridge crowned with larches. One final destination shimmered in her posture. I drew a breath that tasted of cedar and salt and followed, carrying the mosaic of a life that love and a bear's unwavering guardianship had pieced back together against all odds. Morning filtered through the larches like liquid gold when the she-bear stepped into the meadow. No branches screened her now. She crossed open ground with the slow certainty of a priestess entering a sanctuary, sunlight rippling down her ripple-scarred coat. My breath hitched. Every gift she had laid at my feet, blanket, whistle, scarf, drawings, weighted my pockets, but nothing weighed heavier than the question of how this would end. She halted 10 paces away, closer than she had dared before. Her eyes found mine, steady, unhurried, the way time looks at a clock it no longer obeys. Wind rushed through tall grass around us, but the space between us stayed utterly still, a hush so thick it seemed to muffle the earth's turning. I wanted to speak. "Thank you, forgive me, stay," but my throat locked. Tears blurred her outline, and in that watery shimmer I saw 2 bears, the great matriarch before me and the wobble-legged cub pressed laughing against my daughter in a photograph that should have never survived a single winter. She rose, front paws lifted, shoulders rolled back, chest open to the sky. Standing, she seemed to touch a height beyond rules and rifles, a living monument to everything that happens when no one is watching. Frosted breath billowed from her muzzle, a cloud that drifted toward me like incense. No growl, no roar, just one long exhale that carried weight enough to unmake language. I felt it settle over my skin, through bone, until it found the hollow place grief had carved and filled it with something fierce and bright. For a heartbeat the world balanced on that breath. Then her paws touched earth again, soft as snowfall. She held my gaze a final time, and in that amber stare lived a sentence I could finally read. I kept her safe as long as I could. "Now the keeping is yours." She turned. No backward glance, no hesitation. Muscles flexed, fur rippled, and she moved into shadow, each stride quieter than the last. Spruce swallowed her shape, the meadow's grass stilled, and the hush she left behind rang louder than thunder. I stood rooted, tears sliding soundless. I did not understand the full story, how a child nursed a cub, how forest and beast conspired to guard her memory, how love could outlast breath. Yet one truth blazed clear. This was no accident. The universe had woven a thread between my daughter and this bear, and that thread had been placed in my hands. A sob wrenched free. I knelt and pressed my palm to the grass she'd trod. warm still from her passing. "Thank you," I whispered, words shaking like leaves. "Thank you for every heartbeat you carried for her." Wind answered, brushing my face with the scent of pine and distant lilac. Somewhere a raven croaked, then another, their voices crossing the sky like stitches pulling two halves of a wound together. I rose, pockets heavy with relics, heart heavier with awe. The clearing looked ordinary now, sun on grass, dew flickering, nothing to mark a miracle except the trembling in my knees, yet I knew the forest would remember. So would I. She showed me what even a human mother could not preserve, only a wild heart, only the forest. If your heart is racing right now, you understand. Subscribe to the channel. We share the truths the wild keeps. I thought the chapter had closed, but seasons loop the way stories do, and one May morning, exactly 1 year after the bear vanished into spruce shadow, something inside me whispered, "Go back." So I went. I hiked the same ridge, felt the same hush slip around my shoulders like a shawl. The jack pine still guarded the clearing, bark peeling in silver curls. Grass had grown lush, wildflowers nodding where her paw prints once pressed. Nothing looked extraordinary until I saw it, a fresh little mound of brown needles right where the blanket grave used to be. My pulse lurched. No wind had piled those needles. They were arranged, tidy as a child smoothing a quilt. I knelt, fingers trembling, and brushed the layer aside. Underneath lay a single river stone, round, cool, heavy with promise. Across its face, in bold charcoal strokes, ran 3 words that stopped my lungs. Papa, I remember. The letters were stiff, uneven, exactly the way Greta printed her name in kindergarten, tongue out, eyebrows knotted with concentration. Charcoal smudged my fingertips, fresh, as if drawn that very dawn. A loon keened in the distance, the same note her toy whistle once sang. The sky wavered. I had to grip the earth to keep from tipping into the past. A thought burst open. She's still speaking. The forest is still carrying her voice. Maybe the bear returned through winter snow to leave this. Maybe some other messenger did. All I knew was the message reached its target, straight through 31 years of silence, into the softest part of my chest. Tears came hard. I pressed the stone to my heart, felt its chill brand my skin like truth. I no longer had a shred of doubt. This was no game, no coincidence. This was farewell, through a beast, through the woods, through a love that refused to die. The wind rose then, moving the treetops in a slow wave. I listened, half expecting her heavy tread, her cedar-sweet breath. Only rustling needles replied, but the silence carried her presence anyway, the way empty rooms sometimes hold perfume. I spoke aloud, voice shaking but sure. "Thank you, Greta, and thank you, old girl, wherever you are." A raven wheeled overhead, one dark brushstroke against the glaring blue, and croaked twice as if answering. I sat beneath the jack pine for a long while, turning the stone over and over, letting its weight recalibrate the axis of my life. I pictured the bear nudging it into place, arranging needles with that careful sweep of her paw, glancing once toward the trail she knew I'd take. She had guarded my daughter's memory until I was ready to carry it myself. Now she'd sealed the story with one final gift. Eventually I rose. I placed the stone in my pack beside the blanket scrap, the whistle, the scarf, the barrettes, an heirloom set stitched together by paw and claw, an impossible grace. I looked around the clearing one last time, engraving every blade of grass into memory. Then I whispered a promise. Your story stays alive, all of it. I won't let it fade again, and I meant it. If someone else had come to me with a tale like this, I'd have smiled politely and filed it under folktales. But I saw it with my own eyes. I felt the bear's breath, heard the forest speak. And now I know, animals remember, and the woods return what a human has lost. If your heart is brimming with reverence right now, write in the comments. Nature is wiser than us.